Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, partly because I think this water conference is a model of what scientific conferences could be, open-minded, broad-based, and inclusive. Also because Jerry Pollack, who's such an inspiration for all of us, corresponds so closely to my ideal scientist. When I was a child and wanted to be a scientist, I thought that all scientists would be like Jerry Pollack, and open-minded, curious, and unpompous. I soon discovered that actually there aren't very many Jerry Pollacks. In fact, there's only one. So anyway, I'm very pleased to be here. And what I'm talking about this morning is something I've never talked about before, namely water. Because it's a water conference, and I have, over the years, done some research involving water. So this is, what I'm going to be talking about now is something none of you would have heard before, because I haven't done it before. Of course, I'll touch on various themes that are familiar to you, and one of them is vibratory patterns in water. I think one of the problems within the sciences in general is that in the 1950s, when analog computers and digital computers were both viable options, everything went down the digital computing route. And that's given us many benefits. But analog computers model processes by creating processes, rather than trying to break them down into yes and no bits and then kind of reconstruct them from granular atomistic elements. And analog computing provides models of nature which are actually much easier to understand and are in many cases much more appropriate than digital computing. And this is often true of phenomena and processes involving waves. We now know that wave phenomena lie at the very heart of matter. Quantum physics is all about waves and wave patterns. And you can, of course, model those to some degree with equations, but the more complex the wave patterns, the more difficult the modeling becomes. But you can also model them with waves themselves. And the reason I'm so interested in modeling with waves is because I think that the underlying processes in morphogenesis, in chemistry, molecules, crystals, and biology, are to do with what I call morphogenetic fields. And these are basically vibratory fields of activity. They're wave-like and rhythmic. So one way into understanding patterns of vibration is through analog model systems. And vibratory patterns were first studied, well, Leonardo da Vinci was one of the first to observe that when you vibrated piles of dust, they formed patterns. And Chladni, who did the classic work on Chladni patterns on vibrating plates, showed that if you vibrate a plate and you have particles on it like pollen or spores or sand, then the patterns are formed as it lines up on the nodes of the vibratory patterns. And here's a whole series of patterns on vibratory plates showing how form arises from frequency. These particular patterns were produced by Alexander Lauterwasser. Now, Michael Faraday was very interested in these patterns, and he was a very curious and open-minded scientist. And he started looking at them in water. And Faraday discovered that if you vibrate water, you get patterns on the surface, ripples. If you have sloping edges to the container, these ripples fade out like waves breaking on a beach, a sandy beach. But if you have vertical walls of the container, they're reflected, and you get standing wave patterns, and these standing wave patterns are called Faraday waves, after Faraday. Well, it's now possible to study these with a precision never before possible, thanks to the development of the CIMOscope by John Stuart Reid, who's here at this conference. And my son Merlin and I have got a CIMOscope laboratory at our home in London. There it is. The CIMOscope's in the middle, it has a coil that vibrates up and down, and there's a small container here, about 2 centimeters in diameter, with a small volume of fluid. So, and there's a camera that takes, there's the camera, and here's a light ring that gives, illuminates it. And in this, you can control the frequency and the amplitude and do repeatable experiments. This is shows you the kind of pattern you get. You see, that was a threefold pattern with standing waves that oscillate backwards and forwards. So it gives you a sixfold pattern altogether. This is another one. This is an eightfold pattern. And by vibrating at different frequencies, you get a series of patterns: sixfold, eightfold, tenfold, 12-fold, 14, 16, 18, 20. And it goes up further. So there are these symmetry patterns, and these are, as it were, resonant frequencies that appear. When you go up through the spectrum, this one shows, this is a composite, which is what you get if you take exposures fairly, unless you have very quick exposures. With very, very quick exposures, you can see this is an alternation between this pattern and this pattern. This is an alternation between this and this. And so what you're seeing normally is the composite. We went up through an entire spectrum from 50 to 200 hertz. And you get ranges, these are replicates, these three lines. And you get periods when there's no pattern, and then you get into an area where you get a particular pattern, and then you get into no pattern again. It's a bit like old-fashioned radios, where you tune the radio set, and you get a station, and then there's a kind of noise in between, and then you get the next station. So you come in and out of these resonant frequencies. And they show an order as you go up from the bottom here: 6, 8, 4, 10, 6, 12, 8. It doesn't seem to have any logical sequence. But when you plot them on a graph, you see a very distinct series of patterns. This is increasing frequency here from 50 to 200 hertz. And this is the foldness of the pattern with three replicates: 6, 8, 10, 12. 14's missing, 16, 18, 20. Then it all starts over again: 6, 8, 10, 12, and then again. So you see we have these harmonic frequencies. The only way of modeling these mathematically seems to be using Bessel functions, which are really those like vibrating drum membranes. So there's an order in all this, which is what you'd expect really with waves and patterns. When we look at the more detailed patterns, we find that these are like basins of attraction. This is frequency. These are the patterns that we get at these frequencies. And this is the amplitude needed, the minimum amplitude needed to create the pattern. And this is like a tractor, a well. And there's a period point here where you get the pattern very clearly with the minimum energy. And there's an area around it where these patterns, you have to have more energy to make them happen. This is a resonance pattern. And if you look at the vibrations at these bits in between, what you see is something on the cusp of, it's what chaos mathematicians call a chaotic pattern, where it's drawn between two attractors. So this is at the cusp between two of those patterns. Well, you've got the idea that in between there's this kind of unstable area. One of the people who's done most research on this in relation to biological forms is Alexander Lauterwasser here in Germany. And what he's shown is that these radially symmetrical patterns that you get vibrating water have distinct analogues in biological forms like flowers. And they also have analogues in radially symmetrical structures. These are pollen grains. Each of these are from different species, and each species has a particular pattern of the pollen grain. These are single cells. And why this is important is that current thinking about biological morphogenesis is heavily molecular, and most biologists think it all happens just by switching on and off genes. But in a single cell, switching on and off genes can't explain the morphogenesis of a single cell because the genes are the same for the whole cell, and what's switched on and off is the same for the whole cell. So how does a cell, a single cell, create complex form? Well, I think the only answer is through a morphogenetic field. And instead of morphogenetic fields being conceived of as they currently are, primarily in terms of diffusing chemicals, I think they're actually vibratory patterns. And when you see those vibratory patterns and you see these radially symmetrical structures, these are radiolarians, which are also single cells. They live in the sea, single-celled organisms with silicaceous skeletons. Again, I think that the underlying morphogenetic process must depend on wave patterns of some kind, possibly acoustic waves, but more likely electrical wave patterns within the cell membranes. These are famous pictures of radiolarians by Ernst Haeckel. These forms, those are radially symmetrical forms, but vibratory patterns can also give rise to non-radially symmetrical patterns. This is just to remind you that radially symmetrical patterns appear in art. This is the dome of the tomb of Hafiz. And these are rose windows at Chartres and at Notre Dame. And again, there's a limited number of radially symmetrical patterns. I'm not suggesting that they bought a cymoscope and developed these as a result of doing research with cymoscopes, but if you're interested in radial symmetry, there's a limited number of patterns you can arrive at. Now, Pierre, could you help me with this one again? Because this is where we need a film. The film I'm about to show is again from Alexander Lauterwasser, and it shows an isolated drop of water being vibrated. And what's interesting is that it undergoes a kind of morphogenesis. It's free to move. And this looks exactly like an insect embryo with its segmented pattern. It's a remarkable way that this spontaneously takes up this form. Lauterwasser is also very interested in tortoises. And in the middle you see a tortoise shell, and around that you see tortoise-shaped plates on which there's a powder. These are like Chladni figures. And as you see, you can get something very like a tortoise shell pattern through vibrations. These are like the nodes in the vibratory pattern. So I myself think that biological morphogenesis is very largely vibration-based, electrical or acoustic vibrations, and that morphogenetic fields are fields of vibration. And I think this is true also. We know it's true of atoms. We know that an atom is a vibratory pattern in quantum fields, vibrations in the quantum field. It's true of molecules. A benzene molecule, for example, has resonant ring of electrons around it. Crystals are vibratory structures, and so are organisms, and so are we. We have many vibrations in our bodies. We have stir rhythms like heartbeat, breathing, brain waves, and in fact brains have vibratory patterns of activity which are probably much better modeled by vibrating models like these than by digital computers trying to model what's happening in the brain.